welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into an epic, truly cinematic story about how the modern world was forged. We are going to trace the origins and innovations of England's Industrial Revolution. It's a fascinating journey, and we'll be breaking down the classic historical chronology, the key figures, and the essential vocabulary that defined how human civilization was completely reshaped.
It all starts with a pretty massive question, doesn't it? How exactly did a relatively small island nation, 18th century England, manage to ignite a global transformation that forever changed human history? Like, how did they pull off industrializing well before similar developments happened in places like France or Prussia?
Part 1. The perfect English storm. To really wrap our heads around this revolution, we first have to look at the unique geographic, economic, and political storm brewing in England. Because it wasn't just one lucky break, it was a really rare combination of advantages that all hit at exactly the right time.
So what was the recipe for this explosion of industry? Well, first off, geography played a massive role. England had rich deposits of coal and iron ore sitting right near navigable rivers and coastal ports, which made transporting raw materials incredibly cheap. But, natural resources alone aren't enough. Politically, England had a constitutional government established back in 1688 that fiercely protected private property and encouraged investment. Pair that with a thriving merchant class backed by the Bank of England, expanding inland canal systems connecting coalfields in Yorkshire to manufacturing towns, and as culture of scientific exchange championed by the Royal Society, which was founded in 1660. All of these elements wove together to create a self-reinforcing industrial economy that was completely unmatched anywhere else.
But it wasn't just about rocks and rivers. There was a huge and frankly painful human shift that made this possible. The enclosure acts of the 17th and 18th centuries literally forced thousands of rural families off common farmlands. Coupled with new agricultural improvements, things like crop rotation and selective breeding, fewer people were needed to farm. This essentially pushed massive numbers of rural workers toward the cities in search of factory work. It provided the essential human fuel, that growing wage labor force that industrialization desperately required.
Section 2, Sparks of the First Wave. Okay, let's jump into the actual timeline here, where we see the nation's lifeblood shift from traditional wood and water over to coal and steam.
Things started moving fast. Back in 1709, Abraham Darby figures out how to smelt iron with coke rather than charcoal at Coalbrookdale. Then, think about the year 1769. What a massive year for innovation. James Watt patents his improved steam engine, working closely with manufacturer Matthew Boulton to provide reliable mechanical power to mills and mines. And that exact same year, Richard Arkwright invents the water frame and sets up large-scale cotton mills, which created a whole new model for factory organization that would spread like wildfire.
And the timing here is just crazy. Published in 1776, right as Watt's engine is gaining serious traction, Adam Smith drops his highly influential work, The Wealth of Nations. This book provided the philosophical and intellectual engine to justify and really accelerate this explosive free market growth they were seeing on the ground.
Which brings us to a crucial vocabulary term for this era: mechanization. This whole shift to machine-driven production, it wasn't some happy accident. Parliament consistently passed legislation to protect patents, modeled on the Statute of Monopolies. This heavily rewarded inventors and entrepreneurs who were willing to risk their own capital on experimental machines. It was an absolute necessity for figures like Josiah Wedgwood, who took these industrial techniques and applied them to pottery production in Staffordshire, essentially pioneering mass production and modern marketing strategies. Section 3. Accelerating the modern age. Because that initial spark turned into a literal wildfire in the 19th century. We see a rapid succession of technologies that began to shrink the world as we know it.
The momentum building here is just mind-blowing, especially as it crosses the Atlantic. In 1829, George Stephenson builds the rocket locomotive, kicking off the railway age that would knit national markets together. By 1844, Samuel Morse's telegraph is operational, allowing for instant messaging across continents. In 1856, Henry Bessemer patents his steel converter, and by 1879, Thomas Edison invents the incandescent light bulb, followed shortly by his Pearl Street electrical generating station in New York. They were literally illuminating the night and extending the human workday.
I want to zoom in on 1856 for a second. Henry Bessemer's steel converter was an absolute game changer. By making cheap structural steel readily available, this single patented process forged the iron skeleton of modern cities, bridges, railways, and industrial infrastructure across both Britain and the United States. It is quite literally the physical foundation of the modern urban skyline.
Section 4. Cottonopolis and Social Shift.
Now, all of this incredible acceleration came with some incredibly heavy human consequences and a dramatic restructuring of society. 300,000. That was the population of Manchester by the mid-19th century. It went from being this modest little market town to a sprawling, massive industrial city, earning the famous nickname Cottonopolis. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham just exploded as centers of mass production. But the human cost of this growth was staggering. We're looking at a brutal transition here. Inventions like the spinning jenny and the power loom totally automated textile production, and that completely displaced thousands of traditional rural cottage industry workers. They were essentially forced into the unforgiving urban large-scale factory system just to survive. And this massive displacement gave birth to a whole new social class, the proletariat. This new industrial working class endured incredibly long hours, terrible wages, and highly dangerous conditions in these explosive urban factory towns. The harsh realities were so undeniable that Parliament was eventually forced to step in. They passed the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act of 1802, which stands out as one of history's very first industrial reform laws.
Section 5. The Global Industrial Legacy. So, why does all of this historical chronology matter to us right now? Because England's early model established patterns that still dictate our modern existence today.
The impacts literally rippled across the globe. The factory system spread to Belgium, France, Germany, and the US. Those intense social dislocations we just talked about, they contributed directly to the birth of labor movements, trade unions, and socialist political theory. Globally, cities like Liverpool became massive trading hubs, connecting English factories to expanding colonial markets in North America, India, and West Africa. But there were also huge scientific leaps. Louis Pasteur's germ theory and pasteurization in the 1860s transformed public health, completely changing how we fight disease in these dense new cities. And communication? Morse's telegraph evolved into telephone systems championed by Alexander Graham Bell, laying the absolute groundwork for the digital networks we all rely on today.
And it all ties back to this massive concept, the energy transition. This historical shift from wood and water to coal-powered steam, and finally to Edison's electricity, it set the precedent for every global energy shift that followed. Understanding this initial transition is the direct foundation for the debates we are having in the 21st century about oil, natural gas, sustainability, and renewable energy.
From those 18th century coal fields in Yorkshire all the way to Edison's Pearl Street generating station in New York, this chain of events remains the defining economic transformation of the modern era. It is the absolute bedrock of today's global power grids and our entire industrialized way of life.
So I want to leave you with a provocative thought here. As we navigate our own modern revolutions today, things like artificial intelligence, mass automation, and renewable energy, what warnings about social displacement and what inspirations regarding human innovation can we draw from those early pioneers? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.